here. Once again, my name is Abigail Lazier. I'm a master's student at Utah State University, and today I'm really excited to discuss the implications of my research on dwarf crops and how these really innovative genetics are changing the way we grow food as we all collectively develop strategies to help feed the growing world population. And so, as we all know, in addition to a growing world population and increasing agricultural demand, modern agriculture faces many challenges today. Shifting world demographics means that more people are living in urban areas. And we can see that in this figure here, where we see that as of about 2010, our urban world population surpassed rural ones. And so feeding these urban populations poses unique challenges, largely due to the fact that food has to be transported in from surrounding agricultural areas. And so this causes food in urban areas to be expensive, largely unsustainable, and results in thousands of pounds of food waste annually. It also largely contributes to the high levels of food insecurity that we see in urban areas and cities. And so one of the ways we can help address these challenges is by localizing production within the boundaries of cities and towns. And so this is called urban agriculture. So this schematic here is just showing all the various forms that urban agriculture can take. And so anything from in-ground traditional urban garden systems or greenhouses to building integrated production systems like a rooftop greenhouse or vertical farm. And so just to elaborate on these, sort of hypothetical types of urban production, I wanted to just talk through a few real-world examples. And so right here in Salt Lake City, we have the Wasatch Community Gardens, and they do a great job of producing food on an otherwise empty lot. In really highly dense urban areas like New York City, rooftop farms are really popular where there's really not a whole lot of space to be able to grow food at all within the city. Then this is a picture of a aquaponics farm in Hickston, Wisconsin. Superior Fresh is a huge operation. And although this isn't a super highly urban area, it's still really a great great example of how we can use innovative technology to produce vegetables, and in this case, animal protein year-round. This last picture here is showing an example of a vertical farm, which is really a great tool within urban agriculture, especially in really space-limited systems. We're seeing a lot of vertical farms pop up in schools, which is a great way to not only produce on-site vegetables, but also connect the next generation with the local food system. And so all of these are really great ways to help produce food for the local urban population. But of course, just like any agricultural system, they present their own unique set of challenges. And so across all systems, right, planting space or planting area is really a ubiquitous challenge. And we can see how maybe in our community garden or rooftop farming systems, right, there's only so much room in a raised bed or on a roof. And so we're definitely limited on space there. And then in our vertical farming systems especially, we're limited not only in horizontal space, but also vertical space. Another big challenge in these systems is light management. And so obviously in our outdoor systems, right, we have the sun to provide that light and that energy for our plants. But if we're trying to grow food year-round indoors or in a greenhouse via supplemental lighting, right, we're going to have to make sure that we're managing and providing enough light for our plants. A few other challenges I want to mention are water and nutrients. Just like any agricultural system, these are always challenging to manage. We have to make sure we're applying them in adequate amounts, but also not excessively. And then maintenance is sort of a unique challenge. Well, it's not unique to agriculture, but it's unique in the way of urban production systems, just because a lot of times these systems aren't managed by full-time farmers, and so we want to be mindful of the labor, time, and money that we invest in these systems in order to promote their long-term environmental and also economic sustainability. And so while all of these challenges are important to consider, in this presentation, I'm really going to focus on addressing challenges of planting space and light in these urban production systems. And so the first thing I want to get into is how our research addresses the space limitations of our urban production systems. And we can do this by choosing cultivars that were developed to use space efficiently. These are called dwarf crops. As the name implies, dwarf crops are those that have been bred primarily for a small size. So they can be anything from peppers to wheat to rice. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on talking about dwarf tomatoes. And so here's on the screen an example of a dwarf tomato cultivar. And we can see that when we compare that next to a standard, garden variety of cherry tomatoes, right, that our dwarf plant is much smaller. And there's actually another category of these sort of plant sizes, a subcategory of our dwarf plants that has been dubbed micro dwarf crops. And so we can see this is an example cultivar called Twiggy here. And now that if we look at all three of these plants on the screen, we can see pretty obviously how our dwarf and especially our micro dwarf plants are really compact in size. So they have highly determinate growth and really don't require much pruning or trellising, so much less maintenance. And they're really high yielding relative to that small size. So they use less water, less nutrients, and can be grown in using less soil or media. And this all really optimizes them for production in these urban and indoor systems where we're oftentimes growing in containers or under electric lights. And so in addition to addressing these challenges with space, I also want to get into how we can address light limitations in these urban production systems. And before I really get into that too much, we need to understand how we measure light in these systems. And we do that by measuring the daily light integral. And so if you've never heard that term, that's okay. Hopefully I can define it here for you by looking at this schematic here. And so this is an example of the changing light intensity on a clear summer day from dawn to dusk. And we can see how at any point throughout the day, our plants might be getting, more or less light depending on where the sun is in the sky. But the daily light interval is essentially just the sum of all the light that our plant has seen during this day. And so it's just the area under this curve, hence where we get the daily light integral. And so now in our study and in many urban agricultural systems, right, we can also use electric lights. And so we can see what the daily light integral would look like for a system that would be grown under electric lights. And the main difference here, right, is just that our lights are either on or off, and they have a steady state intensity, throughout the duration of the day. And so again, right, this is just the total amount of light our plant has seen throughout the day. And so I said that we did some research to sort of address both these space and light limitations together. And so we actually designed a study where we grew 10 dwarf tomato cultivars at 3 different light levels in order to assess these interactions. Our daily light integral of 30 moles per day, just for reference, that's about the industry standard for tomato production. A daily light integral of 15 moles per day is probably more realistic to what we would see under in a system that was using electric lights. And a daily light integral of 50 moles per day is more like what our plants would experience growing outdoors in the summer. And here's an image of our experiment in action. You can see that these studies were conducted in completely controlled environment rooms where we grew them under electric lights and hooked up to automatic irrigation. Okay, and now to look at some results. So these first few slides will just be pictures of our plants. And so in this slide, we'll look at the first 5 cultivars of dwarf tomatoes that we tested grown at our 3 different light levels here. And so we can see right away, there's some pretty dramatic cultivar differences here. We can see how Regina Red is a cultivar that might produce a lot more vegetative growth, so taking up a lot more space, being a much larger plant than maybe our Twiggy Orange, Twiggy Red, and our Red Velvet plants over here also look pretty compact. Another key sort of takeaway that I want to point out on this slide is just how if we look at our plants grown at 15, 30, and 50 moles per day, we can see that our plants at this highest light level here actually have more red ripe fruit on them than at the previous lower two light levels. And that really speaks to how giving our plants more light can really help decrease the days to maturity, meaning we get ripe fruit in less time. And we can look at a similar set of photos for our second study. And so here's 5 new cultivars grown at those same 3 light levels. And again, we see really drastic differences in cultivar here, with Dora here being just incredibly unruly, producing a lot of vegetative growth, especially at these lower light levels. Red Robin and Siam are also pretty large cultivars. And we see the same trend that we saw in the previous slide, where at this highest light level here, we have more red ripe fruit than we do at the previous lower 2 light levels. And so although we can see these visual differences in sort of the size of our plants, it's helpful to look at this numerically. And so we can do that in 2 ways. And the first is by looking at the height of our plants. So this figure here is showing the height in centimeters or in inches along the y-axis. And along the x-axis here, we have those 3 light levels, so 15, 30, and 50 moles per day. And right away, we see that the plants that looked biggest to us in those photos, Dora, Red Robin, and Siam, are way at the top of this graph here because they were the tallest, whereas those plants that looked like they were smallest, Twiggy and Red Velvet, are in fact towards the bottom of this figure. Another interesting maybe trend in this graph here is just that as we increase our light level, we see that some cultivars follow this trend where they are actually decreasing in size. And so this is just some example pictures of our Twiggy Red cultivar that did follow this trend. We can see this line is sort of sloping down. So I just wanted to point that out as well. And then, of course, in addition to height, we can also talk about plant size in terms of area, canopy area. And so this is canopy area in meters squared or in feet squared at those same 3 light levels along the x-axis. And right away, again, we see our largest cultivars, Dora, Siam, and Red Robin, are at the top of this figure, whereas our smaller cultivars are measuring towards the bottom. In some cases, Dora here is nearly 4 times the size of our smallest dwarfs, so pretty drastic differences. And in this figure, we definitely see a strong relationship between our canopy area and our light. So as we increase the light level here, we see a decrease in our canopy area, and you can see that in these photos. And so obviously, talking about plant size is important if we're trying to use our limited space efficiently in these urban production systems. But we also want to understand what our yield is going to be. And so we can do that by looking at some yield figures here. And so this first figure is just showing yield per plant. And so this is cumulative yield in kilograms or in pounds, again, at those same 3 light levels. And pretty intuitively, what we see here is that our larger dwarf cultivars are at the top of this figure, meaning they produce the most yield on a per plant basis. And the opposite is true of our smaller cultivars, where they produce the least yield on a per plant basis. We can also see a very strong relationship between light level and yield, where the more light we gave our plants, the more yield we were able to get. So pretty important to keep that in mind when we're developing these production systems. We want to make sure we can give our plants the most light that we can. And so I mentioned that this figure, right, is showing yield per plant. So this would be significant. This might be what you would want to draw your conclusions from if you were trying to choose a cultivar that would be best if you were only interested in maybe growing one plant or you weren't space limited at all. But if you were space limited, say you had a given area on a greenhouse bench or on a kitchen windowsill, well, then you might actually want to look at yield on a per unit area basis. And so now we're looking at cumulative yield in kilograms per meter squared or pounds per feet squared, actually taking the size of these plants into consideration. And we can see right away that our conclusions now might shift as to which cultivars are yielding the highest on a per unit area basis. And so we can see red velvet that was performing relatively poorly over in this figure, actually now is performing the best at this highest light level, outperforming some of our larger cultivars like Dora, Red Robin, and Siam. And so really important that we make this distinction so that we know how to choose cultivars based on the space limitations of our system. Along with that, I mentioned that vertical gardens especially are limited not only in horizontal space, but also vertical planting space. And so now we can look at yield on a per unit volume basis to take both horizontal and vertical space limitations into account. And now we see again, actually this time, all of our smallest cultivars are outperforming our larger cultivars on a yield per unit volume basis. In some cases, really dramatically. And in this figure, we still see an even more exaggerated relationship with light, where the more light we give our plants, the more yield we can get. And so that was a lot of figures that I sort of just threw at you. So let's summarize some of our key findings just by looking at some pictures here. And so in this slide, I'll summarize our key takeaways that we found regarding our dwarf cultivar effects. And so I've sort of ordered all 10 of those cultivars that we studied, roughly from biggest to smallest. And what we saw in our findings is that as our plant size decreased, our yield per plant decreased. And this makes pretty good sense, right? Smaller plants are not going to be able to produce that much just simply because they're smaller. But when we take the size of those plants into consideration and the fact that we could actually grow more of them in a given area, because of that, we saw that our yield per unit area increased along with our yield per unit volume. So pretty important findings here. Key takeaways of the effects that we found regarding our light level is that as our light increased, we saw generally that our plant size decreased. This makes sense because when we're really dumping all that light, all those photons onto our plants, they don't need to work quite as hard to grow all that, produce all that vegetative growth to capture those photons. So our plant size decreases with light. We also saw that as we increased our light, our yield increased. This makes sense because more light means more photosynthesis for our plants, more yield for us. And when we looked at those pictures of our plants, we also saw that there was more red ripe fruit at our highest light level, meaning that as we increased our light levels, our days to maturity decreased. And to sort of wrap this up here, if you're at a point where you're ready to get started with your own urban garden, there's just a few key considerations that I want to remind you of when you're designing that system. And so the first two things you need to sort of hammer out are your location. So will this be an indoor or an outdoor system? And then what kind of system you'd like to design. So if you're in a highly urban area, can you safely grow plants in the ground? You know, a lot of times in urban areas, we're dealing with compaction or soil contamination. So if, those would prevent an in-ground system, maybe consider doing some container gardening or raised bed gardening, or maybe even try your hand at a hydroponic or aquaponic system. And then in this presentation, based on these two, once you have these two logistical pieces figured out, I covered how you can address the unique space and light limitations of your system. So if your system is really highly space limited, consider using a dwarf or even a micro dwarf cultivar. And then if you are going to be providing supplemental lighting for your plants, you really want to make sure you can give your plants as much light as possible. And so when you're shopping for those lights, in order to do that, you want to look for the best photon per dollar or watt per dollar ratio, thus giving your plants the most amount of light and also giving you the most bang for your buck. And with that, that concludes my presentation here today. I want to thank my mentors, Noah, Bruce Bugby, and Milena here. And of course, along the way, I've had much technical support to aid in this research. So happy to take questions.
So thank you, Abby. It's very nice to hear something, pretty useful, I would say, for small farms. We have like 5 minutes. Josh, are you there for questions? Abby, there is actually just one question in the Q&A, so you can probably reply afterwards. There are more questions actually.
Okay, I see them now. I think I'll
Yeah,
just
do you
read
see
the
them?
question and then I
Yeah,
can
maybe, yeah,
answer.
if you want.
Okay, then I have till 9:30.
Yeah,
Okay,
we can
great.
address questions. We have like 5 minutes. Sorry, yeah, 4 minutes to address questions, I would say.
Okay, so this first question here is asking how mass establishment farms and other agricultural infrastructures in urban areas can support production on food security in the world. Okay, so I think what this question is getting at is how large scale farms might be able to make use of these innovative genetics. And so I think, especially in a greenhouse setting, those systems are going to be way more space limited than an outdoor production system. And so in that case, you'd certainly want to consider using maybe dwarf varieties, and especially if you're going to be growing these crops using a vertical system where you're then stacking trays of plants. And then regarding light level, especially in a greenhouse, a mass production greenhouse, you would see really drastic improvements in yield if you could give your plants even just a little bit more light. So I think those are pretty relevant to this question. If I didn't answer that well, feel free to ask a clarifying follow-up question. Okay, this next question here is, do you have any plans to develop a step-by-step guide for individuals interested in setting up their own indoor or vertical gardening systems, including installation and required components? That's a great question. Thank you for asking. I do have plans to develop a step-by-step guide, and my mentor, Dr. Noah Langenfeld, he is also pretty invested in this work. And together with Milena, we're hoping to develop some fact sheets that she'll be able to have on her website for anyone who's interested in getting started. If you have no gardening experience, that's okay. The whole idea of this project is that even if you just want to grow a few tomato plants in your kitchen to have fresh grown tomatoes in the winter, that you can do that with relatively low cost and low, maintenance to you. So we want to make it as accessible as possible to everyone. So keep an eye out for that if you're interested. Okay, this next question says, everyone always asks which lights they should buy, what do I like, how to get 50 DLI. This is a really great question. It's also kind of complicated to answer, especially if you are familiar with shopping for lights on Amazon. You know that it's pretty hard to find the information that you need. So some manufacturers report light output in watts or micromoles. Some even use lumens, which is a terrible unit. So to get at this question, we're actually also hoping to produce a fact sheet that answers this. So hopefully we'll give you more direction there. But in general, you want to look for, like I said, lights that have the best watt, the highest wattage output, or the highest micromolar photon output, if you can find that information. And then, of course, you can actually lower the closer you can keep the lights to your plants, you're going to get higher light level. And then if you have the ability to adjust that as your plant is growing, you can really keep that plant just a few inches above your plant canopy. Hopefully I answered that to you. How to get to 50 DLI, you probably never get that in an indoor system. We don't even get that in our greenhouses here at Utah State. Okay, next question. Do the tomatoes taste as good with the dwarf plants? This is a great question because this is one of the things we looked at here in my research. We looked at the bricks of these dwarf tomatoes. And so some of them have really high bricks, upwards of 10 and 11 degrees. And so those, you can actually really taste the difference. So one of the cultivars I mentioned is called Twiggy, and they have a really good flavor, I think, comparable to, organic grown cherry tomatoes. Some of them, however, because when they're doing this genetic manipulation, sometimes they accidentally change the genes that make the tomatoes taste good in order to keep them small. And so some of them taste quite bad. So that's something that we're considering in this research when we then go to make cultivar recommendations to growers. Okay, and I have maybe 20 seconds here. So this last question is just, do I have any plans to see if these same trends hold true for other types of vegetables? And would I expect similar findings? Another great question. So like I said, there's lots of dwarf crops out there, and we actually are working on getting some dwarf pepper seeds, as well as dwarf pea seeds, so snap pea seeds, to be able to run similar experiments. And we generally do expect the same findings, especially for peppers, for peas, being that they're a little more shade tolerant. They might do better at those lower light levels. But great question.